Good evening, and welcome to another journey into the forgotten corners of history. Tonight, we're stepping into the flour-dusted, steam-filled world of Victorian baking, where the simple act of making bread could quite literally kill you. So settle in, dim the lights, and let me tell you about a profession that was equal parts essential and lethal. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy these deep dives into history's darker corners. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. There's something wonderfully comforting about knowing we're all sharing these stories together, scattered across the world, united by curiosity about the past. It's 3 in the morning in Victorian London, 1850-something. The gas lamps flicker weakly against the perpetual fog that clings to the city like a damp shroud. Most of the world sleeps, but not everyone. In the basement of a narrow building squeezed between a gin shop and a rag dealer's stall, a man named Thomas is already 2 hours into what will become an 18-hour shift. His hands, permanently stained with flour and soot, knead massive quantities of dough while sweat drips steadily from his brow. The temperature in this underground chamber hovers around 85 degrees, and it's only going to get hotter. Thomas is a baker, and in Victorian England, that meant he was slowly dying for his daily bread. The story of Victorian baking is not the romanticized tale of jolly bakers pulling golden loaves from cozy ovens. It's a story of systematic exploitation, toxic ingredients, and working conditions so brutal they would make a coal miner weep. These were men who rose before dawn, worked in temperatures that would hospitalize modern workers, and handled substances that were literally poisoning their customers one loaf at a time. They were the unsung heroes of urban survival and the unwitting villains of public health. To understand just how deadly this profession was, we need to descend into the bakehouse itself. Picture, if you will, a basement room with stone walls that perpetually wept moisture. The ceiling is low, barely 6 feet in some places, forcing tall men to work in a permanent crouch. There are no windows because natural light might improve morale, and we certainly can't have that. The only illumination comes from a few oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across surfaces coated in a film of flour dust so thick it moves like living thing. The heart of this underground hell is the oven, not a neat, controlled appliance with temperature dials and safety features, but a massive brick monster that devours coal and belches smoke like a dragon with indigestion. This beast must be fed constantly, its fires stoked every few hours throughout the night and well into the next day. The heat it generates turns the already stifling bakehouse into something resembling a steam bath designed by someone with a grudge against human comfort. But Thomas and his fellow bakers don't simply endure this heat, they work in it. They lift 50-pound sacks of flour, knead hundreds of pounds of dough, and maneuver heavy wooden paddles to slide loaves in and out of the oven's mouth, all while wearing the heavy woolen clothing of the era, because synthetic fabrics haven't been invented yet, and cotton is expensive. Imagine wearing a thick wool coat while exercising in a sauna for 18 hours straight, and you're beginning to understand their daily reality. The work begins at 11 at night, just as respectable people are settling into bed. Thomas starts by making the dough, a process that requires him to mix massive quantities of flour, water, and other ingredients in wooden troughs that haven't been properly cleaned since the reign of George III. This isn't the gentle folding and kneading you might see in a modern artisan bakery. This is industrial food production powered by human muscle and desperation. The flour itself presents the first of many hazards. Every movement sends clouds of fine particles into the air, creating a fog so dense that visibility drops to mere feet. Breathing becomes an exercise in controlled suffocation as the dust coats the inside of noses, throats, and lungs. Thomas has developed what he calls his baker's cough, a wet, persistent hack that keeps his wife awake during his few precious hours of sleep. He doesn't know it, but he's developing what we would now call occupational asthma, a progressive lung disease that will slowly rob him of his ability to breathe. Oh, the flour dust doesn't just threaten his lungs, it creates an explosive environment. A single spark from the oven or an oil lamp can ignite the suspended particles, turning the entire bakehouse into a fireball. These explosions aren't rare accidents. They're inevitable disasters that bakers simply accept as part of the job. Some bakeries burn down multiple times, their owners rebuilding each time because the alternative is starvation. As Thomas works through the night, his clothes become soaked with perspiration. The combination of heat, humidity, and physical exertion creates conditions that would be considered dangerous even by modern industrial standards. Heat exhaustion is common, heat stroke frequent, and death from hyperthermia accepted as an occupational hazard. There's no air conditioning, no electric fans, not even adequate ventilation. The only relief comes from briefly stepping outside into the London fog, which passes for fresh air in this era. Around 2 in the morning, Thomas allows himself a brief rest. He doesn't go to a comfortable bed or even a proper chair. Instead, he throws himself down on the wooden kneading board, using a flour sack as a pillow and another as a blanket. The board is covered in dough residue, flour dust, and whatever else has accumulated during the night's work. He lies there in the same stifling atmosphere where he's been laboring, breathing the same contaminated air, trying to snatch a couple hours of sleep before the next phase of work begins. This isn't rest in any meaningful sense. It's a brief unconsciousness that barely qualifies as sleep. His body never truly recovers, never reaches the deep, restorative stages of sleep necessary for physical and mental health. Day after day, night after night, this cycle continues until chronic exhaustion becomes his natural state. His judgment becomes impaired, his reflexes slow, and his susceptibility to accidents increases dramatically. At 4 in the morning, Thomas drags himself off the board and begins the most dangerous part of his shift. The ovens are now at their hottest, radiating heat, like furnaces. He must shape the risen dough into loaves, slide them into the oven using long wooden paddles, and retrieve finished bread while dodging jets of steam and avoiding contact with surfaces hot enough to sear flesh from bone. Burns are so common that bakers develop a patchwork of scars across their hands and forearms, badges of honor in a profession where injury is inevitable. But the physical dangers are only part of the story. The real horror of Victorian baking lies in what goes into the bread itself. Thomas doesn't simply mix flour and water. His daily routine involves handling substances that would make a modern food safety inspector flee in terror. The flour he uses isn't the pure refined product we know today. It's been adulterated by millers looking to increase profits, bulked up with chalk, ground bone, and sawdust. Sometimes it contains plaster of Paris, the same material used to make sculptures and repair walls. The flour sacks often harbor insects, rodents, and their droppings, all of which get mixed into the dough because waste not, want not. To make the bread white and appealing to customers, Thomas adds alum, a chemical compound that makes the loaves look clean and prosperous. He doesn't know that alum causes stomach cramps, constipation, and chronic diarrhea. He doesn't know that in children it can cause dehydration severe enough to be fatal. He only knows that white bread sells better than brown bread, and his family needs the income. The water he uses comes from the same contaminated sources that supply the rest of London. It carries cholera, typhoid, and a dozen other diseases. But boiling it for bread making doesn't eliminate all the dangers. Sometimes the water tastes metallic. Sometimes it smells foul. But Thomas uses it anyway because clean water is a luxury his profession can't afford. The salt might actually be plaster of Paris if his supplier is particularly unscrupulous. The yeast could be contaminated with harmful bacteria. Every ingredient in his daily routine carries the potential for disaster, and Thomas handles them all with his bare hands, breathing their fumes, occasionally tasting them to check quality. This isn't malicious poisoning, at least not usually. It's the result of an unregulated food system where profit margins are razor thin and survival depends on cutting corners wherever possible. Thomas isn't trying to hurt anyone. He's trying to feed his own family while providing an essential service to his community. But in doing so, he's unknowingly participating in a system that slowly poisons everyone involved. The bread he produces might look wholesome, but it's a chemical cocktail of adulterants and contaminants. His customers don't know this, of course. They see clean white loaves and assume they're getting quality food. The irony is heartbreaking. Poor people spending their precious few coins on bread that's making them sicker, while the baker who makes it suffers even more from direct exposure to the same toxic substances. As dawn approaches, Thomas begins preparing rolls and fancy breads for the morning trade. This requires even more precise timing and coordination, all while battling the fatigue that comes from working through the night in an environment hostile to human life. His hands shake slightly from exhaustion and caffeine withdrawal. He has no coffee, only weak tea when he can afford it. But he must maintain the steady rhythm necessary to produce hundreds of individual items. The bakehouse fills with the aroma of baking bread, a smell that should be comforting, but has become associated with endless labor and physical suffering. Other workers begin arriving for the day shift, if you can call it that, since many of them have been working almost as long as Thomas. The bakery operates on a schedule that acknowledges no weekends, no holidays, and no concept of work-life balance. By 7 in the morning, the first customers begin arriving at the shop above. Thomas can hear their voices through the thin floorboards, the cheerful chatter of people starting their day with fresh bread. They have no idea that the man who made their breakfast hasn't slept properly in months, that his lungs are slowly filling with flour dust, or that their daily bread contains enough toxic additives to stock a chemistry laboratory. Odd, the irony cuts deep. Thomas provides sustenance for hundreds of families, yet he can barely sustain himself. His own diet consists mainly of the bread he makes, supplemented occasionally with thin soup or scraps of cheese when money allows. He's malnourished despite working in food production, his body slowly consuming itself to fuel the endless demands of his profession. Around 9 in the morning, Thomas finally emerges from the bakehouse to help with sales. The transition from the underground furnace to street level is jarring. The relatively cool air of a London morning feels like stepping into an ice box after hours in the depths. His clothes are soaked through with sweat, his face is streaked with flour and soot, and his eyes are bloodshot from smoke and exhaustion. But there's no time to clean up or rest. Customers expect service, and the master baker expects profits. Thomas arranges loaves on wooden shelves, weighs out portions for individual buyers, and smiles politely while fighting to stay upright. His hands leave floury prints on everything he touches, and his persistent cough occasionally interrupts conversations with customers who step back slightly, unconsciously avoiding whatever illness they assume he's carrying. The customers themselves present a cross-section of Victorian society's desperation. Factory workers stopping by before 12-hour shifts in textile mills. Domestic servants purchasing bread for their employers' households. Children sent by mothers who can barely afford the few pence required for the family's daily ration. Each transaction represents someone's survival, someone's attempt to ward off hunger for another day. What none of them realize is that they're participating in a slow-motion catastrophe. The bread they're buying contains alum levels that would be illegal by modern standards. The flour has been stretched with ground bone and chalk, reducing its nutritional value while adding substances that interfere with digestion. Some loaves contain traces of arsenic, accidentally introduced through contaminated additives or storage near industrial chemicals. The poisoning isn't dramatic. There are no immediate deaths, no obvious symptoms that can be traced directly to the bread. Instead, it's a gradual weakening, a slow erosion of health that manifests as chronic stomach problems, unexplained fatigue, and increased susceptibility to disease. Children are particularly vulnerable. Their developing bodies unable to process the toxic load hidden in their daily bread. Thomas sees the effects but doesn't understand the cause. He notices that his regular customers often look pale and tired. Children seem to get sick frequently. Elderly customers complain of digestive problems. But the connection between these health issues and the bread he's selling never occurs to him. How could it? The bread looks fine, smells good, and provides the calories people need to survive. The idea that food could be slowly poisoning people is beyond his understanding. By noon, Thomas has been working for 13 straight hours. His shift is nowhere near finished. The afternoon brings its own demands: preparing dough for tomorrow's baking, cleaning equipment, that will never truly be clean, and helping with deliveries to customers throughout the neighborhood. The wooden handcart loaded with bread is heavy, and pushing it through London's crowded streets requires navigating horse-drawn traffic, avoiding pickpockets, and dealing with customers who complain about prices while having no idea of the true cost of production. The delivery rounds reveal the geography of urban poverty. Thomas knows which neighborhoods can afford white bread and which must settle for darker, cheaper loaves. He knows which customers will pay immediately and which will beg for credit until their next wages arrive. He sees families rationing their bread allowance, making a single loaf stretch for days, and he understands that for many of his customers, his product isn't just food, it's the difference between survival and starvation. The weight of this responsibility is crushing. Every loaf he makes feeds someone, but every loaf also exposes them to health risks they can't imagine. Thomas carries this burden without understanding it, driven by economic necessity to participate in a system that slowly harms everyone involved. The afternoon heat makes the delivery rounds particularly brutal. London in summer is a furnace of brick, stone, and human activity. The sun beats down on narrow streets designed for horses and pedestrians, not the industrial traffic that now chokes them with dust and noise. Thomas, still weakened from his night in the bakehouse, struggles to maintain his pace while the loaded cart seems to grow heavier with each stop. His body begins showing the cumulative effects of months and years of this routine. His back aches constantly from lifting heavy bags and working in cramped spaces. His hands are permanently cracked and scarred from heat, chemicals, and rough handling of equipment. His cough has worsened, sometimes bringing up blood that he wipes away without thinking much about it. Sleep deprivation has become so chronic that he sometimes hallucinates, seeing movement in his peripheral vision or hearing voices that aren't there. But perhaps the most insidious danger comes from the chemicals he handles daily. The alum that makes bread white also makes Thomas sick. Every time he measures it out, mixes it into dough, or breathes the dust it creates, he's exposing himself to a substance that irritates his stomach lining and interferes with his digestion. Combined with his poor diet and chronic stress, this exposure creates a perfect storm of gastrointestinal problems that will plague him for the rest of his shortened life. The plaster of Paris used to bulk up flour presents its own hazards. When mixed with water, it creates a paste that can cause respiratory problems if inhaled and digestive issues if ingested. Thomas doesn't know this, of course. He only knows that adding it to flour makes the dough feel different, slightly gritty and harder to work. He assumes this is normal variation in ingredient quality, not realizing he's working with a substance designed for construction, not consumption. Even more dangerous are the accidental contaminations that occur regularly in Victorian food production. Arsenic, used in everything from wallpaper dyes to rat poison, finds its way into baking ingredients through careless storage and labeling. A bag of flour might be stored next to containers of industrial chemicals, absorbing toxic vapors over time. Sugar might be contaminated with arsenic-based preservatives. Salt could contain heavy metals from primitive refining processes. The infamous Bradford incident of 1858 illustrates just how easily those accidents could occur. A confectioner ordered powdered gypsum for his sweets, but received arsenic trioxide instead due to a mistake at the wholesale chemist. The resulting poisoned sweets killed 20 people and sickened over 200 more. This wasn't malicious intent, it was simple human error in a system with no safeguards, no quality control, and no accountability. Thomas and every other baker in England lived with this possibility hanging over them daily. Any ingredient could be mislabeled, any supplier could make a fatal mistake, and any batch of bread could become a weapon of mass poisoning. The knowledge that such disasters were not only possible but probable added another layer of stress to an already brutal profession. By 4 in the afternoon, Thomas returns to the bakehouse to begin preparations for another night of baking. The cycle starts again, mixing dough, tending fires, working in temperatures that would be considered torture by modern standards. His clothes, briefly cooled during the delivery rounds, quickly become soaked with sweat again as the underground furnace reclaims him. This is when the rats make their appearance. Victorian bakehouses are paradise for rodents, offering warmth, shelter, and unlimited food supplies. They nest in flour sacks, burrow through wooden storage containers, and treat the entire operation as their personal buffet. Thomas has given up trying to keep them out. Instead, he's developed a grudging coexistence with them, occasionally finding their droppings mixed into ingredients and simply sifting them out as part of the routine. The rats aren't just unsanitary, they're dangerous. They carry diseases that can be transmitted through their waste, and their presence indicates just how little control bakers had over their working environment. In a properly managed food production facility, pest control would be paramount. In a Victorian bakehouse, rats are simply another hazard to be endured alongside heat exhaustion, toxic chemicals, and explosive flour dust. As evening approaches and gas lamps are lit throughout London, Thomas settles in for another night of labor. His family won't see him awake for days at a time. His children are growing up with a father who exists mainly as a tired figure, sleeping during daylight hours and vanishing into work before they wake. His wife manages the household alone, stretching their meager income to cover rent, food, and the medical expenses that come from Thomas's deteriorating health. The social isolation of night work compounds all the other hardships. While the rest of London sleeps, Thomas and his fellow bakers labor in their underground chambers, cut off from normal human interaction and the rhythms of daily life. They form their own society of exhausted, poisoned men, bound together by shared suffering and mutual dependence. When one baker collapses from heat stroke or succumbs to lung disease, the others carry on, knowing their turn will come eventually. The economic pressures driving this system were as brutal as the working conditions themselves. Thomas earns perhaps 16 shillings a week when work is steady, barely enough to keep his family fed and housed in one of London's deteriorating tenements. A single room serves as kitchen, bedroom, and living space for him, his wife, and their 3 children. The walls weep moisture in winter, and summer brings the stench from overflowing sewers that runs beneath their building like a toxic river. But even this meager wage isn't guaranteed. The baking trade suffers from deliberate oversupply of workers, a system designed to keep wages low and desperation high. Master bakers across Scotland and northern England maintain a steady stream of apprentices, training them for years before dismissing them the moment their formal apprenticeship ends. These newly skilled but suddenly unemployed bakers flood into London, creating a surplus of desperate men willing to work for whatever pittance is offered. Thomas knows that dozens of men would eagerly take his place if he complained about conditions or demanded better wages. This knowledge keeps him silent when his cough worsens, when his hands crack and bleed from handling caustic additives, when exhaustion makes him stumble near the open oven mouth. Speaking up means unemployment, and unemployment means watching his children starve while he searches for work that may not employ as Thomas exist. The master baker who operates on margins so thin they barely qualify as profit. Every penny saved on ingredients, every corner cut in working conditions, every hour squeezed from exhausted workers represents the difference between solvency and bankruptcy. The master isn't cruel by nature, he's trapped in the same economic vice that crushes his employees. Wholesalers demand payment for flour and coal. Landlords insist on rent for the bakehouse. Customers haggle over prices while having no understanding of production costs. This creates a cascade of compromises that flow downward through the entire system. Millers adulterate flour to reduce costs, passing savings to bakers who desperately need them. Bakers add their own adulterants to stretch ingredients further. Chemical suppliers offer cheaper alternatives to traditional ingredients, never mentioning that these alternatives are industrial compounds designed for manufacturing, not food production. Everyone in the chain knows something is wrong, but no one has the economic freedom to change it. The customers themselves unwittingly drive much of this poisonous economy. They demand white bread because it appears cleaner, more refined, more suitable for respectable families. They don't know that achieving this whiteness requires chemical bleaching agents that interfere with digestion. They insist on consistent texture and long shelf life, impossible to achieve with natural ingredients alone. They want affordable prices, forcing bakers to find cheaper and cheaper ways to produce acceptable products. Thomas watches this tragic dance play out every day in his shop interactions. A mother counts pennies carefully before purchasing bread for her family, unaware that those same economic pressures have forced him to use ingredients that will slowly sicken her children. A factory worker complains that prices are too high, while his own wages are being cut by employers facing similar competitive pressures. Everyone is trapped in a system where survival requires participation in collective poisoning. The nights blur together into an endless cycle of mixing, kneading, baking, and selling. Thomas loses track of time, of seasons, of normal human rhythms. His world contracts to the dimensions of the bakehouse and the familiar geography of his delivery routes. The broader city exists only as a collection of customers and obstacles, a maze of streets where he pushes his heavy cart while fighting off the effects of chronic sleep deprivation. Sleep, when it comes, brings little relief. The few hours he manages on the flour-dusted kneading board are interrupted by coughing fits that rack his chest and leave him gasping for clean air that doesn't exist. His dreams are filled with the sounds and smells of the bakehouse, the roar of the oven, the scrape of wooden paddles against brick, the persistent wheeze of his own labored breathing. Even in unconsciousness, he cannot escape the profession that is slowly killing him. His wife Sarah notices the changes that Thomas himself refuses to acknowledge. His weight drops steadily as malnutrition takes its toll despite his proximity to food. His skin takes on a grayish pallor from constant exposure to flour dust and chemical additives. His hands shake when he thinks no one is watching, tremors that could indicate nerve damage from toxic exposure, or simple exhaustion so severe it approaches medical crisis. The children learn not to expect their father during daylight hours. They grow up believing that fathers are nocturnal creatures who emerge briefly at dawn before disappearing again into mysterious underground realms. When Thomas does interact with his family, he's often irritable from fatigue, his patience worn thin by the constant stress of dangerous working conditions and economic uncertainty. Sarah tries to supplement their income by taking in washing, but the few pence she earns barely make a difference. The family diet consists mainly of the bread Thomas brings home, supplemented occasionally with thin soup made from vegetable scraps and bones begged from the local butcher. They're slowly starving despite living above the poverty line, their bodies unable to extract adequate nutrition from adulterated food. The medical consequences of Thomas's profession accumulate with each passing month. His persistent cough develops into something more serious, episodes where he struggles to breathe while pink foam appears at the corners of his mouth. His stomach cramps worsen, sometimes doubling him over during work, as the alum and other chemicals he handles daily take their toll on his digestive system. Burns from the oven heal slowly and poorly, leaving infected wounds that drain his energy and compromise his immune system. But perhaps most insidious is the gradual poisoning that affects his nervous system. The lead compound used in some glazes and the arsenic that accidentally contaminates ingredients don't kill quickly. Instead, they accumulate in his body over time, causing subtle changes in coordination, memory, and judgment that make his dangerous work even more hazardous. Thomas notices that he sometimes forgets familiar procedures, standing confused in the middle of tasks he's performed thousands of times. His hands, once steady and sure, occasionally betray him at crucial moments, nearly causing him to drop hot loaves or miscalculate ingredient measurements. These lapses terrify him because he understands that any serious mistake could cost him his job. But he doesn't realize they're symptoms of chronic poisoning rather than simple aging. The social stigma attached to his profession adds another burden to his already overwhelming load. Respectable society views bakers as members of the working class, certainly, but also as men who work with their hands in dirty, disreputable conditions. The flour dust that clings to his clothes and hair marks him as someone who performs manual labor, automatically placing him below clerks, shopkeepers, and other workers who manage to stay relatively clean. This social positioning affects every aspect of his family's life. His children face discrimination at school, where teachers and other students can identify them immediately as offspring of working-class parents. Sarah finds herself excluded from certain social circles, her association with a baker limiting her opportunities for friendship and community support. The family exists in a social limbo above the absolute destitution of casual laborers, but well below the respectability of skilled craftsmen. The contrast between the essential nature of his work and its low social standing creates a bitter irony that Thomas feels keenly. Everyone needs bread. Everyone depends on bakers. Yet society treats them as expendable drudges whose suffering is simply the natural order of things. This contradiction gnaws at him during the long night hours, adding psychological torment to his physical suffering. The bakehouse itself becomes a character in this tragedy, a malevolent presence that shapes everyone who enters it. The walls, permanently stained with soot and flour, seem to absorb the life force of the men who work within them. The floor, worn smooth by generations of bakers shuffling through their endless routines, bears witness to decades of suffering and early death. The ovens, constantly hungry for fuel and human attention, devour coal and life with equal appetite. Other workers drift in and out of Thomas's awareness like ghosts. Some are apprentices, young men full of hope who haven't yet realized what their chosen profession will cost them. Others are veterans, broken men in their 30s and 40s who look decades older, their bodies ravaged by years of exposure to heat, chemicals, and exhaustion. A few are masters trying to maintain their own operations while slowly succumbing to the same health problems that plague their employees. The turnover is constant and rarely discussed. Men disappear from the trade regularly, some dying from occupational diseases, others fleeing to different work before the bakehouse can finish destroying them. Their places are quickly filled by new arrivals, desperate enough to accept any employment, ensuring that the system perpetuates itself regardless of its human cost. Thomas has seen strong men reduced to wheezing invalids within a few years of entering the trade. He's watched skilled bakers develop respiratory problems so severe they can barely climb stairs, let alone handle the physical demands of bread production. He's witnessed the slow mental deterioration that comes from chronic exposure to toxic substances. Men who once possessed sharp minds gradually becoming confused and disoriented. Yet he continues, driven by economic necessity and the absence of alternatives. His skills are specialized but not transferable to other industries. His lack of formal education limits his options. His deteriorating health makes it unlikely that other employers would hire him even if opportunities existed. He's trapped in a profession that's killing him, unable to escape and unwilling to abandon his family to destitution. The rhythm of industrial London provides whistles mark the beginning, the soundtrack to his suffering. Factory and end of shifts, he'll never work. Church bells toll hours he rarely hears because he's underground, separated from normal time by the demands of bread production. The clip-clop of horses pulling delivery wagons reminds him of the world above, a world that depends on his labor while remaining ignorant of its true cost. As winter approaches, the working conditions become even more brutal. The contrast between the overheated bakehouse and the frigid London streets creates thermal shock, that weakens immune systems already compromised by malnutrition and chemical exposure. Thomas finds himself constantly fighting off colds and respiratory infections that linger for weeks, his body lacking the resources needed for proper healing. The shortened daylight hours mean he sees even less of his family. He descends into this bakehouse in darkness and emerges in darkness, his world reduced to the artificial illumination of oil lamps and oven glow. This sensory deprivation adds to his mental fatigue, creating a dreamlike state where the boundaries between waking and sleeping become increasingly blurred. But Thomas endures because he must, because stopping means watching his children starve, because this terrible work is still work in a city where unemployment means death. He endures because he doesn't fully understand what's happening to his body, doesn't realize that the cough and tremors and digestive problems are symptoms of systematic poisoning rather than natural aging. He endures because hope, however misguided, continues to flicker in the depths of human desperation. And so the great machine of Victorian bread production grinds forward, consuming men like Thomas while feeding a growing urban population that depends entirely on their sacrifice. The system works in its cruel fashion, producing enough bread to prevent famine while ensuring that those who make it die young from preventable diseases. It's a bargain struck in ignorance and maintained through desperation, a testament to humanity's capacity for both survival and systematic cruelty. The tragedy deepens as we follow Thomas through the autumn months of 1854. His condition has deteriorated noticeably, though he lacks the medical knowledge to understand why his body is betraying him. The persistent cough now produces flecks of blood that he carefully conceals from his wife and fellow workers. His hands shake more frequently, making the precise movements required for shaping dough increasingly difficult. Yet he continues, because in Victorian England, showing weakness means losing everything. The bread he produces tells its own story of systematic contamination. Each loaf contains a cocktail of substances never intended for human consumption. The chalk used to whiten flour leaves a gritty residue that customers dismiss as texture. The alum creates a chemical burn in stomachs already weakened by poor nutrition. The bone meal, ground from animals that died of unknown causes, introduces pathogens that Victorian medicine cannot identify or treat. Thomas's customers begin experiencing their own health problems, though none connect their suffering to their daily bread. Mrs. Whitmore, who buys 2 loaves every morning for her boarding house, develops chronic stomach pains that keep her awake at night. Young Jimmy Fletcher, who devours thick slices of bread before his shift at the textile mill, grows increasingly pale and listless as arsenic accumulates in his small body. The elderly Mr. Ashworth, already weakened by a lifetime of industrial labor, finds his digestive problems worsening with each passing week. The poisoning spread through London's working-class neighborhoods like an invisible plague. Families attribute their various ailments to bad air, poor sanitation, or divine punishment for unknown sins. The idea that their basic food supply might be slowly killing them never occurs to anyone, least of all the bakers who handle these toxic ingredients daily. Thomas witnesses this suffering without understanding his role in creating it. He sees his regular customers growing sicker, children losing weight despite adequate food, adults developing mysterious ailments that no physician can properly diagnose. The guilt gnaws at him in ways he cannot articulate, a vague sense that something is terribly wrong with the world he helps sustain. The economic pressures driving this systematic poisoning continue to intensify. Competition among bakers forces each to find cheaper ingredients and faster production methods. Master bakers who refuse to adulterate their products find themselves undersold by competitors willing to sacrifice quality for profit. The few honest operations either adapt or disappear, leaving only those willing to participate in the collective poisoning of their community. Thomas's master, a man named Jeremiah Crowthorne, exemplifies this moral compromise. He began his career with genuine intentions to produce wholesome bread, but decades of economic pressure have worn down his resistance. He now orders the cheapest flour available, knowing it contains industrial adulterants. He purchases alum by the hundredweight, fully aware of its effects on human digestion. He stores ingredients carelessly, allowing cross-contamination with toxic substances used for other purposes. Crowthorne justifies these choices through an elaborate system of self-deception. He tells himself that other bakers do worse things, that his customers seem satisfied, that regulatory authorities would intervene if real dangers existed. He points to his own survival as proof that the work isn't as dangerous as reformers claim, ignoring the obvious signs of his own declining health. The relationship between Crowthorne and Thomas illustrates the complex web of complicity that sustains Victorian food production. Neither man is fundamentally evil, yet both participate in a system that causes immense suffering. Thomas needs employment to feed his family. Crowthorne needs profitable operations to maintain his business. Both are trapped by circumstances that make ethical choices economically impossible. The apprentices who work alongside Thomas provide a glimpse into the future of the trade. Young men arrive full of energy and ambition, eager to learn a skill that promises steady employment. Within months, they develop the telltale signs of occupational disease, persistent coughs, digestive problems, premature aging. Some flee the trade before permanent damage occurs. Others, like Thomas years earlier, accept their fate and settle into the slow decline that defines a baker's career. One apprentice, a boy named Robert Caldwell, particularly haunts Thomas's conscience. Robert arrived 6 months ago, bright-eyed and eager, the son of a factory worker who scraped together money for his training. Now, the boy coughs blood into his handkerchief and struggles to lift flour sacks that once seemed manageable. Thomas sees his own younger self in Robert's declining health and feels powerless to offer warning or assistance. The master-apprentice system that governs the trade creates its own form of systematic abuse. Young men sign contracts binding them to years of service in exchange for training, but these agreements trap them in dangerous conditions with no legal recourse. They work the longest hours, handle the most dangerous tasks, and receive minimal compensation while their health deteriorates. When their contracts end, they're dismissed to make room for fresh victims, flooding the labor market with skilled workers desperate for employment. This deliberate oversupply of workers ensures that wages remain low and working conditions unimproved. Men like Thomas compete against younger, healthier workers willing to accept even worse treatment. The threat of replacement prevents any organized resistance to dangerous practices or demands for better working conditions. The social reformers who occasionally investigate bakery conditions face a wall of silence maintained by economic desperation. Workers refuse to testify about dangerous practices because they fear losing their jobs. Masters deny problems because they fear regulatory intervention that might increase costs. Customers remain ignorant because the truth would force them to confront their role in sustaining systematic poisoning. Dr. William Guy, a physician who studies occupational diseases, attempts to document the health effects of bakery work. His interviews with workers reveal a catalog of suffering, respiratory diseases, digestive disorders, nervous system problems, and premature death. But his reports disappear into government files, ignored by officials unwilling to challenge an industry essential to urban survival. The few attempts at regulation prove toothless and easily circumvented. The Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860 creates theoretical penalties for contaminating food, but enforcement mechanisms are virtually non-existent. Inspectors lack training to identify adulterants. Laboratories cannot test for most contaminants, and penalties are too light to deter profitable fraud. Thomas learns about these regulatory efforts through whispered conversations with other workers, but he holds little hope for meaningful change. He's seen too many promises broken, too many investigations lead nowhere, too many reform movements collapse under economic pressure. The system that's killing him seems as permanent and immutable as the London fog that chokes the city every winter. The seasonal cycle brings its own variations in suffering. Summer heat makes the already brutal bakehouse conditions nearly unbearable, while winter cold creates thermal shock that weakens immune systems. Spring brings hope that quickly fades as another year of declining health becomes apparent. Autumn carries the weight of accumulated damage, the realization that recovery is impossible and survival uncertain. Thomas's family adapts to his deteriorating condition in ways both heartbreaking and practical. Sarah takes on additional washing to supplement their income, her hands raw from lye soap and constant moisture. The children learn to be quiet during his brief sleeping periods, understanding instinctively that their father needs rest even if they don't comprehend why he's always tired. Young Mary, Thomas's eldest daughter, shows particular insight into her father's condition. At 12 years old, she's developed the premature wisdom common among children of the working poor. She notices details that adults ignore or explain away. The way her father's breathing sounds like paper tearing, how his hands leave bloody prints on bread loaves, the yellow tinge that's crept into the whites of his eyes. Mary begins helping in the small ways, bringing her father water during his delivery rounds, organizing his tools to make his work more efficient, even learning to read the simple mathematics required for customer transactions. She doesn't realize she's preparing to take over responsibilities that will soon become too much for Thomas to handle. The other children, Thomas Jr. and little Emma, remained largely innocent of their family's crisis. They play games that mirror their father's work, pretending to bake bread with mud and sticks, unconsciously preparing for lives that may follow the same tragic pattern. Their laughter provides moments of joy that sustain Thomas through his darkest periods, reminders of what he's sacrificing his health to protect. The neighborhood where Thomas's family lives reflects the broader social conditions that make his profession both necessary and deadly. Crowded tenements house families packed into single rooms, sharing privies and water sources that spread disease with ruthless efficiency. The streets run with sewage and industrial waste, creating an environment where contaminated bread is just one of many health hazards. Yet this same neighborhood depends entirely on Thomas and bakers like him for survival. Without daily bread delivery, families would face starvation. The corner bakery serves as a social center where neighbors exchange information and support. The familiar sight of Thomas pushing his cart through familiar streets provides stability in lives otherwise marked by uncertainty and hardship. This dependency creates a twisted form of gratitude that makes Thomas's sacrifice seem noble rather than tragic. Customers genuinely appreciate his service, unaware that receiving it requires him to slowly poison himself and them. Children wave excitedly when they see his cart approaching, associating him with the food that keeps them alive rather than the toxins that compromise their health. The psychological impact of this misplaced gratitude weighs heavily on Thomas's conscience. He wants to deserve the trust placed in him, wants to provide genuinely wholesome food to families who can barely afford what he offers. But economic reality forces him to participate in their systematic poisoning, creating a more moral burden that compounds his physical suffering. Religious faith provides some comfort, though it also creates additional torment. Thomas attends Sunday services when his work schedule permits, finding solace in hymns and prayers that promise eventual relief from earthly suffering. But he also struggles with the theological implications of his situation, wondering if his participation in food adulteration constitutes a sin that will be punished in the afterlife. The local priest, Father McKenna, tries to offer guidance but lacks understanding of industrial conditions that create moral dilemmas unknown to previous generations. His advice to trust in divine providence and accept suffering as part of God's plan provides little practical help to a man slowly dying from occupational poisoning. Thomas's relationship with alcohol follows patterns common among workers in dangerous trades. The local gin palace offers temporary escape from physical pain and psychological torment, but it also drains resources needed for food and medicine. He drinks sporadically in binges that worry Sarah and create additional stress in an already strained household. The gin itself presents another source of contamination, adulterated with industrial chemicals that make it cheaper to produce and more intoxicating to consume. Thomas doesn't realize that his occasional drinking exposes him to additional toxins that compound the damage caused by his occupation. The brief relief alcohol provides comes at the cost of accelerated physical deterioration. As 1854 draws to a close, Thomas faces a winter that will test his remaining strength against conditions that have already pushed him beyond normal human endurance. His cough now wakes the entire family at night. Sarah lies beside him, listening to the wet, rattling sound that signals fluid accumulating in his lungs. His weight loss has become so dramatic that his clothes hang loosely on his frame, making him appear decades older than his 32 years. The bread he produces shows signs of his declining capabilities. Loaves emerge from the oven slightly misshapen as his weakened hands struggle with familiar tasks. Customers begin commenting on inconsistencies in texture they attribute and taste, though these changes to seasonal variations in ingredients rather than their baker's deteriorating health. Thomas knows his time is running short, though he cannot bring himself to discuss this knowledge with his family. Instead, he tries to teach Mary more about the business, showing her how to calculate prices, measure ingredients, and interact with customers. She learns quickly, her young mind absorbing information that will soon become essential for her family's survival. The cycle continues, relentless and inexorable, grinding through human lives like grain through millstones. Thomas represents just one casualty in a system that consumes workers as efficiently as it produces bread. A man whose sacrifice feeds a city while destroying one, the who makes it possible. His story multiplies across London, across England, across the industrial world, where human beings become raw materials in the machinery of progress. And still, the ovens burn, the dough rises, the bread emerges golden and poisonous from depths where desperate men trade their lives for wages barely sufficient to sustain the families they're trying to protect. The great mill of industrial capitalism turns another revolution, grinding flesh and bone into profit margins measured in fractions of pennies, while the city above remains blissfully ignorant of the true cost of its daily bread. And so, Thomas's story fades into the London fog, one voice among thousands, silenced by a system that valued profit over people, efficiency over life itself. The Victorian baker's tale reminds us that progress often comes at a price paid by those who can least afford it. These men who fed a nation slowly poisoned themselves and their neighbors, trapped in an economic machine that ground human suffering into daily bread. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, remember Thomas and the countless others who sacrificed everything for survival. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me in the forgotten corners of history.